So it's well documented that it's been a struggle to get a constitutional convention, but that's one of two ways to amend Kentucky's constitution, either by a constitutional convention where you just overhaul the whole thing, or by getting a legislature approved amendment being put on the ballot for the voters to decide. So the only way you can have a referendum or initiative is that the legislature agree to it. There's a whole bunch of rules and shit that they're only allowed to pick, this issue and that issue. I think they can pick any issue that they want to. When they pick to change the Constitution, to amend it, then they will put that issue to the ballot, and then that's how the Constitution has been getting changed. And so actually any constitutional change has to go through the people first. There's been several years in 1931, 1947, 1960, and 1977 when the Constitutional Convention question was put up for a vote, and the voters had rejected it. And I think we need to pay attention to each and every one of these attempts, because to see why they got thrown down. Why did they get thrown down? What were the things that had caused them from stopping? So that way when the 2014 or 15, the June 1st, 2014 or 15 Constitutional Convention in Kentucky happens, that you can, avoid the same pitfalls that had happened in the past. So there's only two ways to do it. Legislature puts the amended Constitution for the public to vote on, or for a revised Constitution. We revised it even though we rewrote the whole thing, or a whole Constitutional Convention, which is a pain in the ass. So this thing actually out of the Kentucky Encyclopedia was interesting to me, because they sort of had bypassed it, and they used Section 4 of Kentucky's Constitution in order to bypass it. So the General Assembly created the Constitutional Revision Assembly in 1964, adopted its draft of a proposed revision, and then avoided Section 258's laborious convention procedure by submitting the statute for direct popular approval pursuant to Section 4 of the Bill of Rights, which provides in part that the people have at all times an unalienable and indefeasible right to alter, reform, or abolish their government in such manner as they may deem proper. The Court of Appeals in Gatewood versus Matthews, 1966, accepted the Section 4 argument and upheld the statute, but the voters overwhelmingly defeated the revised Constitution in the 1966 election. So that's another year that they had, the voters had a revised Constitution in the 1966 election. And so just to be able to put that issue to the voters was an arduous, really fucking hard task, right? And so that was the 1966 election, and then also the Gatewood versus Matthews. I wonder if that's it's probably not Gatewood Galbraith, because it's usually last names, but it's an interesting issue to kind of take a look at, because the Supreme Court said that you can actually, put a revised Constitution up for the people to vote on through the Section 4, so you don't have to go through the convention procedure. Instead, just submit a statute. So that's an interesting tactic. In order to go, instead of doing a convention, you could just offer a statute. And the statute would just kind of put it right straight through. You would still need the voters' approval, but instead of having to do a statute, I propose a statute to dissolve the current Constitution and provide for a brand new Constitution. And so that statute would effectively be a constitutional convention. So that's the 1966 constitutional debacle, I guess you could say. It paid close attention to it because the Court of Appeals in Gatewood v. Matthews accepted the Section 4 argument and upheld the statute. So the 1891 Constitution also provides for change by amendment. Section 256 authorized the legislature by a 2/3 vote to propose no more than 2 amendments at a time, revised to 4 in 1979. So you could put a total of 4 issues on the ballot by the legislature, right? A total of 4 whole issues for the public to decide if the legislature even puts anything up on the ballot. Ratified by a simple majority at the next state general election. So 2/3 vote to propose no more than 2 amendments at a time. The legislature, 2/3 vote. 10 minimally altered the General Assembly's tax and spending powers. In a similar fashion, several other amendments changed constitutional provisions governing the compensation of public officials in legislative session, corporate behavior, local government, and the election process. What? As of November 1990, 30 amendments have been ratified, but almost all of them make only very limited changes. 10 minimally alter the General Assembly's taxing and spending powers. So as of November 1990, only 30 amendments have been ratified. And then they're saying that they weren't that much. They didn't change that much. So they said 10 of them minimally alter the General Assembly's taxing and spending powers. In a similar fashion, several other amendments change constitutional provisions governing the compensation of public officials, the legislative session, corporate behavior, local government, and election process. Oh, just the fucking local government election process, legislative, the fucking money for the people in the corporate. That's it. Only 2 speak of. So it's kind of bullshit that they're saying it's not that much. Only 2 speak to the spirit of a good constitution. That one extends the suffrage to 18-year-olds. The other, really an act of mini constitutional revision, modernizes the judicial system. Which is, I think that was 1975. So it modernizes the judicial system. So to sit there and say actually that the changes are minimal, that's such horse shit. The author of this is incredible. They're saying that there is very few changes, but really they're changing the taxing and spending powers. They're changing how the public officials are getting paid. They're getting them paid even more, right? Of course, they're going to pay themselves more. The legislative session, so they're going to change how the legislature operates. Corporate behavior, which almost sounds like they're being more permissive with the corporate behavior. They're going to change local government, how local government operates, and the election process, the entire fucking election process, and how local government. And then they say 2 of them was to a spirit of a good constitution, which I don't know what the fuck that even means. And then one extends the suffrage, which is the only it's not a little one, but that's the one I can clearly understand. Extends the suffrage of 18-year-olds. So now anybody that's 18-year-old can vote. The other was really an act of mini constitutional revision, modernizes the judicial system, and that was 1975. And so that was a mini constitutional revision. So they all sound like mini constitutional revisions because they're changing some huge parts of the Constitution. Overall, the amendment process has not meaningfully altered the 1891 Constitution, nor has it adapted the Constitution to the 20th century, but merely modified its statutory detail. If the 1891 Constitution's revision and amendment provisions have not solved the dilemma it created, neither have the actions taken by the Governor, General Assembly, and Judiciary adapted the Constitution to the realities of 20th century governmental life. Judicial legitimation of gubernatorial and legislative action has, however, been a significant and subtle and fragmented method of constitutional change, as in the Kentucky Supreme Court's decision on governmental compensation, revenue bonds, and constitutional revision. The 1891 Constitution limited salaries of state officials, we're going to hear about this again, to $5,000. In 1949, amendment raised the limit to $12,000, but a specific dollar limit, of course, cannot respond to the impact of inflation. In Matthews v. Allen, 1962, the rubber dollar case, the Kentucky Supreme Court remedied the situation by holding that circuit judges would not receive an adequate compensation for their services as required by Section 133 unless their nominal dollar salaries as established by the amended Section 246 were construed to enable the General Assembly to maintain their salaries, and indeed those of all constitutional officers, at the purchasing power of the 1949 dollar. And so the 1949 amendment came by, and then you had a judicial ruling which basically backs up on that fucking amendment that says the rubber dollar case, Matthews v. Allen in 1962, which says that the purchasing power of 1949 is what public officials are going to get paid. And so that was 1962, Matthews v. Allen, and it was a rubber dollar case. So Matthews v. Allen, and then the so-called rubber dollar case. And rubber dollar, so that means, you know, the dollar can be flexed to be whatever. So, you know, that's great for the politicians. They can pay themselves the purchasing power, which they can just mandate, but they don't, you know, they don't mandate that for the workers. And again, it's constitutional change, so they're really changing the details of the Constitution without having to change the Constitution. The Constitution also severely limits the General Assembly's powers to finance public projects and economic development, but in a series of decisions from Van Heuser v. University of Kentucky, 1936, to Blythe v. Transportation Cabinet, 1983, the court has held that legislation authorizing the use of revenue and moral obligation bonds to finance public buildings and roads does not violate the public debt limitations of Section 49 and 50. In Hayes v. State Property and Building Commission, the Toyota Incentive Agreement case, the court upheld a further expansion of Sections 49 and 50 and also Sections 171 and 177, which limit the use of taxes for public purposes and forbid donations and loans of state credit to private corporations. So the expansion of Sections 48 and 90 does not violate the public debt limitation. So they're not allowed to go, I guess, under $500,000 in public debt. And they're also saying the sections 171 and 177, which limit the use of taxes for public purposes and forbid donations and loans of state credit to private corporations. So I guess for Toyota Incentive Agreement, in order to get Toyota to come in, they had to fucking bend some of the sections of the Constitution. So they're breaking Constitution. I guess in 1787 is when Hayes v. State Property and Building Commission came through. And creative judicial decisions, however, are not enough to make the Commonwealth's basic law a good constitution. Piecemeal constitutional changes, whether by amendment or by judicial decisions, have had limited value in meeting the needs of a modern state. In this regard, the direct submission method of constitutional change has eliminated not only the most insuperable barriers imposed by the 1891 Constitution, but also the excuse so frequently offered by Kentuckians and their elected representatives that their Constitution is to blame. If Kentuckians are interested, what changes need to be made to provide a good Constitution? Guidelines may be found in the National Municipal League's Model State Constitution, Kentucky Constitutional Revision Assembly's proposed 1966 Constitution, and the constitutional revision experiences of Illinois, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, which have rewritten their 19th century charters within the last quarter century to more closely comport with Marshall's maxim. At a minimum, the archaic constitutional material that should be deleted includes the limits on the number of legislative employees, the dueling prohibition, provisions concerning the Railroad Commission, temporary succession of the lieutenant governor, and racially based separate schools. Statutory provisions in the Constitution, especially these governing taxation, finance, and corporations, should be substantially revised. While these changes should occasion little opposition, other provisions also essential to a good constitution will be much more difficult to introduce because of continuing popular distrust of government and preference for using suffrage and statutory detail of the Constitution to control public officials. The changes needed, some of which have already encountered a hostile public response as the subjects of failed constitutional amendments, would include revisions in the salary limitations on public officials, the biennial legislative session, and on and on. Okay, so I want to write down the proposed 1966 Constitution, because 1966 was a proposed Constitution, right? And so that's interesting. And then they also mentioned several states. They said Illinois, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. So Illinois, Pennsylvania, which we got a lot of our shit from to begin with, and you know, it was a good model to begin with. So Illinois, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. So we can check out those states' constitutions and see how they're operating, if they're operational or not, because the opinion of the Kentucky Encyclopedia, edited by John E. Kleber, they do not like the constitutions that they are faced with right now. So it says, in any debate over a revised constitution with these provisions, that the core Kentuckians should seriously re-examine the constitutional controls their forebears have imposed on the state and its local governments as the Commonwealth enters its third century. So that's Kentucky, the Constitution, the 1950, the 1850, at the very end of this here, the persistence of the anti-slavery advocates prompted the pro-slavery majority to make the ownership of slaves as absolute property. So again, you got reactionary forces who are pushing way too hard. They're actually going to make ministers illegal. They're going to make ministers illegal. You can't be a minister and pass and become a public official. Elsewhere, the Constitution stated that even the largest majority did not possess absolute arbitrary power over the lives, liberty, and property of free men. General Assembly was directed to enact legislation ordering any free Negro or mulatto coming into Kentucky or any slave afterward emancipated to leave the state or suffer penitentiary confinement. Efforts to put in the Constitution the provisions of the recently repealed Non-Importation Act of 18 33, which prohibited the importation of slaves for commercial purposes, were defeated. So it was really bad hit for slavery. The 1850 Constitution made it easier for slaves, and it strengthened up slavery. So 1850 was about, they were losing their slaves and they were scared about it. And so the waspy, fascist, totalitarian capitalists did what any fucking psychopath would do, and they passed more laws to defend their barbaric practices.